Welcome to Winning Dynasty, where I am trying to figure out how Dynasty fantasy football works, how to win so I can win my leagues, and you can too. Today, we're going to be going into a second part of this study that I'm doing on the value of rookie draft picks in Dynasty fantasy football. So, a few weeks ago, I covered round one, looking at how valuable are those picks. If you have a first round rookie draft pick, what is that worth? Today, we're going to talk about second round picks. If you missed the first part, I'll put a link so that you can watch that first video. But the basic overview of this study is I took the last 6 years of data, looked at rookie drafts order, all the rookies that were drafted in dynasty leagues, what was the draft order, and then what was their startup ADP, average draft position, in dynasty rankings as a whole that first year and then the following years after to see kind of where the value is, where do people value these players once they've been drafted, depending on where they got drafted in those rookie picks, so that we can see, hey, if I've got this second round pick, what's that going to potentially project out to look like? Everything can be, there's all kinds of exceptions, but wanted to see if there's any patterns that we can find so that we can understand how valuable are these picks. So when we're trying to trade them or trying to acquire them, we can kind of know what's a fair deal. Am I getting a good deal, a bad deal? What are the chances that this will be worth it and I'll win this trade? Or do I just hold on to the picks because that's going to be better than trying to trade it away for whatever I'm trying to get, that kind of thing. So I took this data from Dynasty League Football, DLF, and put it all into some charts that I'll share and some patterns that we found, and we'll go over that. So first, I want to show the breakdown of all of these data points, all of the average draft positions in startup rankings for these players. And you can see we have kind of a typical bell curve. Obviously, there's some exceptions on the right, especially with older players. When we go back, 5 or 6 years, the ones that were truly a bust, they're going to pop up a little bit more. So that's a little bit of a flaw in this study, is those ones are going to add up a little bit more. Whereas, if there was more current players that hadn't busted, they're not going to show up as much because they've only played 1 or 2 years. But you can see a little bit more of a bell curve, and so the pattern towards the middle of these values. And so I broke down kind of based on top 25, top 50, what percentage of these second round picks end up having this average draft position. So only 4% of the second round picks end up in having top 25 startup value. And so I took this data just from August, so the very beginning of the NFL season, not throughout the season, but at the very beginning. Were they valued as a top 25 dynasty player? Only 4% of these second round picks. And then even top 50, only 9%. So not even 10% of these second round rookie picks made the top 50. 25% were in the top 100. 34% as top 120. And so I use top 120 as a marker because in probably a lot of leagues, but especially personally, the one that I'm going to be starting this fall in 2024, it's 12 teams and you start 10 players. So 120 basically is kind of like the mark of the average, really, I guess, the lowest end starter. If you're better than 120, you're probably starting in this league that I'm in. If you're lower than 120, they probably shouldn't be starting for you. So 120 is kind of that marker. 34%, about a third of these second round picks end up being valued as a starter. And then 70% are in the top 200. And so you can kind of reverse that, and 2/3 are not starters. And then 30% don't even make the top 100, top 200, I mean. And so definitely a lot more, when you compare from the first round data to the second round data, a lot more, a lot more busts, certainly. But definitely not the high end values that you saw in the first round that you can see that top graph there being the breakdown of the first round picks, the bottom being the second round. The first round, there's a lot of that high end data, and it kind of slowly, goes down. Whereas this was more of a bell curve, where the bulk of the data was in the middle of the graph. So pretty significant, differences between the value in these first round picks and the second round picks, and we'll continue to get into that more. So breakdown. Just looking at a few different things. The best, Josh Allen. So we did get a number one. Josh Allen was valued number one. I think actually that might be this year, year 7. He's valued number one right now in dynasty startups. And so you can get that higher end. Like I said, it's a small percentage, but you can find that diamond in the rough. There were 19% that of the seasons that we looked at, they didn't even go drafted in dynasty leagues. Which the data that I'm looking at, it didn't go into like the 300s, 400s. And so if you're in a really, really deep league, they may have been drafted, but um, for the data that we have, they weren't even on the list for ADP. So average was 132, median was 142 and a half. We're going to use median more often just because there's a lot of the busts where they go way down and they kind of drag down the average. Um, and so it was actually interesting that the median was a little bit higher here. But going by year, so year one, the value, year two, year three, year four, year five of these players that were drafted in the second round, it actually drops from 140 and a half to 132 by year two. And there were 7 players that were undrafted their second year. So second round players, all of them, got drafted in that first year going into their rookie year. But then going into the second year, there were 7 that didn't even get drafted in fantasy. But the median got a little bit better. And the reality is that's probably because there were some players that really did well and they brought that median way down. And the ones that didn't do bad, yeah, there were 7 that were undrafted, but there were probably a lot that people were still kind of holding out hope for that. Well, they were, I did draft them in the second round. It was still pretty high value. So I'm going to, still hold on to them, even though they might end up not being that good. And that's where we can see in year 3 that median goes up to 151. There was 12 undrafted. Year 4, 181, 13 undrafted, and it keeps going up. So those values definitely hold on stronger early on. Year 2 is the strongest. So the verdict of what's the value, it'll probably be dependent on where they're taken, which we'll get into next. But if you can get a top 50 player, if someone's willing to trade you 1-for-1, a top 50 player for your second round rookie pick, again, not really knowing where it is, it's just maybe it's a future 25, 2026, rookie pick that you don't know exactly. You probably kind of know, but you don't know exactly where it's going to be. Top 50 player for sure is going to be a much better shot than getting a better than top 50 player in that second round. Even top 100, it's probably worth taking because, like we said, the median is right around 140. Year 2 at 132, so half the data is above 132. So you're probably taking a pretty good chance by taking that top 100 player 1-for-1. So when you get to 101 to 150, that's where you kind of need to consider things. And if it's 1-for-1, you got to just figure out do you like the potential of that player, and it's going to be kind of something you have to figure out. Outside of the top 150, I'd probably stick with my second round pick just because there is that chance that they could be solid. And then outside of the top 150 player, if they're a veteran already outside the top 150. Of course, yeah, things could change and they could get better, but chances are they're probably just going to keep decreasing in value. So I think that's kind of roughly where I would draw the lines. But again, not knowing where the pick is, it's hard to tell. And so I looked at based on if it was an early, mid, or late pick. And I can't remember if I already mentioned this, but this is all based off of a 12-team league. So early would be the first 4 picks in the round. Middle would be 5 through 8, and then late would be 9 through 12 in that round. And so you can see we have a chart here. The blue is the early, orange is the mid, gray is the late. The box with the color in it, that represents 50% of the data. Below it is 25%, above is 25%. And so when you look at this, the blue and the orange, actually the orange is all kind of that bulk. I'm looking at that box. So that's like where the bulk of the data is. It's actually kind of contained inside the blue. So really not a huge difference. Yes, it does go a little bit lower, which means that there are some of those higher end players in the blue in those early picks. But it also goes a little bit higher. So there actually are a little bit more of the not as good, values in that first round or that early part of the second round than there are in the mid. So, just at a quick glance, it kind of looks like the early and mid is really not a huge difference. You're kind of going to have a similar outcome. But then when we get to the late, it actually jumps up quite a bit. So the bottom of that 50% box is much higher. It's actually higher than the median, I think, in the blue, and almost as high as the median in the orange. So a lot higher. And then the worst is much worse as well. So at this kind of first glance, it does seem that the early and mids similar, lates, once you get to a late second round pick, that's when the value really drops off. And so I compared it to the first round because when we did the first round study, basically what we found out was the early, those first 4 picks seemed to be a lot more valuable than the mid and the late, but the mid and the late weren't all that much different in the first round. Here it seems like the early and the mid are actually pretty similar, and the late is much worse. So I was curious, like those early and mid second round picks, how do they compare, especially to those mid and late first? Is there a big difference there? Or are those actually all fairly similar? I was kind of curious. So I put them together, um, line them all up, and so you can actually see that it's actually pretty drastic. So those mid to late, first round picks, even though those are fairly similar, they're pretty significantly better than the early to mid second round picks. Even though those are pretty similar. So um, and a drastic difference between those early first and those late seconds. So just again at a quick glance of this, you can clearly see those first round picks overall much better, and we saw that in the first chart where it started at the higher end and kind of went down and down, whereas the second it started low and got bigger for that chart, meaning more of the data was in the middle of the ADP values. So again, I think those first round picks just a lot more valuable. And then when it comes to the second round, early to mid, it's not too much of a difference, but those late picks start to really drop in value. So I broke it down between early, mid, late, just looking more details at the numbers. You can see those top 25 again. It's low. Even the early picks, only 6%. There's a very low chance that second round pick is going to turn into a really top 25 elite dynasty player, or at least be valued that way. Even top 50, the early does have a better chance, 15%, but in those mid and lates, it's very, very unlikely that they're going to be even a top 50 player, which is why, earlier I said if I can get a top 50 player for a future second, I would take it, because even if they are an early second, it's still only a 15% chance that they are worth the top 50 value. So probably hard to swing that trade, but just saying that's definitely something I would pretty much take in an instant. We get to top 100, you got a third in the early, still only 14% in the late. When you get to top 120, that's where the starters are. You get almost half. We're almost at half of those early second round picks end up being basically starting worthy players in Dynasty. A third of them in the mid round become the starters, and only in the late, it's only 19%. So one in every five late second round picks ends up even being worthy of a starting value in Dynasty. Top 150, that's where you do get over the 50% mark for the mid rounds, but still the late round, second round picks, only 37% make the top 150. So I think, we said before, if it was in that 101 to 150 range, you'd have to kind of think about it. If I know that I have a late second round pick and I can get a top 150 player, it kind of almost feels like that's almost a no-brainer as well, because there's a pretty good chance that that late second round pick just isn't even in the top 150. So if you can get someone that's proven as a top 150 player, now if it's an early or mid second round pick, that's when you have to think about it a little bit more, because there's more of a chance that that rookie could turn into a better player. Top 200, I think numbers even out a little bit more. Top 250. So just interesting. And then again, in the top 250, you get those mids a little bit higher than the early. That's where we saw in that chart where the earlys actually had more of the worst data too, which is just kind of interesting. But just a few examples, just so you kind of know, like, what are we looking at in terms of like these players that are in these second rounds. Some of the early seconds that were picked, Josh Allen, who obviously has been very good for fantasy. AJ Brown, very good. And then you have guys like T. Higgins, Calvin Ridley, Tony Pollard, who are not like those elite top guys, but have had very good value in Dynasty. The mid seconds, you got Amon-Ra, Debo, Ayuk, Pittman, and then recently Rashee Rice. All those guys are, again, besides Amon-Ra, who's pretty elite, none of these guys are like super high at the top, but they're all very solid players for Dynasty. And then the late second, you got, the exception, Jalen Hurts. Is a really good value for anyone that drafted him, late in the second round of their rookie draft. Laporta also was kind of a steal. And then you got guys like McBride, Marquise Brown, Jaden Reed. Again, guys that aren't, they're not the elite, but they are pretty solid value players in the second round. So this is the best of the best kind of way you're looking at, which I wouldn't, especially for these late seconds, I wouldn't assume that you're going to get one of these guys. You might. Whereas in the early seconds, there's a little more of a chance that you might get one of these. Maybe the Josh Allen, the AJ Brown is very unlikely, but you might be able to get a Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley type player in that early second round if you really hit with that pick. I just broke down the years. So based off year one data, year two, year three in the league, where these guys are drafted, what did that median look like? You can see from the start, earlies it's 120 for the year one and 139 for mid, 155 for late. And so, yeah, it's not a drastic difference, but there's certainly that difference in value in year one, just based off of where they were drafted. But then by year two, those early and those mids, the median is the same. And so that's again where you see a lot of those values are pretty similar, as we saw in that box plot, where the early and the mid values were pretty similar. But then by year three, you could see the mids and the lates actually end up being pretty similar. So I think that's where you just have. I think it's just kind of a little bit more random of like there's guys that are kind of weighing down the the median just because there's a lot more busts. So it's kind of hard to tell there, but that's kind of the breakdown of those. So overall, summary, main takeaways. Those early second round picks, much more likely to have the high end players. So if that's really what you're hoping for with that second round pick, early is certainly better. But it's still way less likely than the mid to late first. So when we compare those first round picks, if you can get a late first pick, that's going to be much more likely to hit than that early second round pick. One for one, if you can acquire a low end fantasy starter, so we said 120 is kind of the bottom, so 90 to 120 would be kind of that low end fantasy starter. If you can get that player for your mid to late second round pick, it's probably going to be worth it, especially if it's a late pick. Even if it's an early, it might still be a decent trade. I would aim a little bit higher, maybe, just because you could get a little bit more value for an early pick. Someone that doesn't really know, someone that hasn't watched this video might look at, an early second, that's pretty much the same as a late first, and so that's pretty valuable. Where we know that there is quite a bit of difference, but if you can get someone in the 70 to 100 range, that's great. Overall, mid seconds aren't too much worse than early seconds. Just in terms of like if they're gonna have a bust career, not gonna be that good. The high end is a little bit better in the first, but in the early. But like we said, there's actually more of the busts in the early second too compared to the mid. So I think a couple things that you can try and do. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but if you can try and trade up, if you can take your late second round pick and maybe add something on, maybe you add on a third or fourth round pick, which we'll get into those studies later on to see what those values are. But maybe add on a later pick or just another player that you're not super high on, and you can try and get into the early to mid second round, or even get into a first round, which would be great. I think it's kind of worth it because those late second rounds just aren't going to be super likely to hit. Or if you're on the other side, you have an early second, maybe you can try and trade back a few spots. Not a lot because you don't want to get into the late second round, but if you have the second pick in the second round and you can trade back to the fifth pick, just like a few spots, and there's someone that sees that as valuable because they really want whoever you might be able to draft at that second pick. Trade back. See if you can trade back, and maybe you get there on top of that, you get their second round pick next year, or even just a third or fourth or something else, knowing that hey, you're getting a little bit of value on top of that, and you're not really losing a lot, from going early to mid. Again, there's a lot that depends on this. Is just a very generalized look at like what you could be doing to gain value. But that's what I would, looking at this is what I would suggest based on the value. So that's round one. I'm going to get into rounds 2 and 3. We'll even do a round 5. I know some drafts don't even have a round 5, but I'll kind of look at that data just to kind of see if there's anything that stands out. And so I'll do a future video. I'll probably do a round 3 video and then maybe combine rounds 4 and 5 into one more video. So thanks for watching. Hope this helps. Definitely leave a comment, message me, let me know if this is helpful or if you've found anything different that might say otherwise to what I've found. I'm here to learn, here to get better, and would love to share that with everyone that's watching and following. So thank you, and good luck.